Last episode I went over the foreign policy of the Ottoman Empire and why they sided with the Central Powers. Today I will go over their war aims, what they wanted out of the agreement. But the video will also look at it from the other point of view. What would the war aims of the Ottoman Empire be if they joined the Entente? As it was a close call who they could have sided with at many points during the build-up to war. Starting with them joining the Central Powers, what were Ottoman war aims? And to do this, I am going to run the same thought experiment I have run for all the nations I have covered so far. What if they won and dominated the scene? This is not alternate history. How they win does not matter. I am merely recreating a fantastical scenario that seems logical enough to accept, to further understand their war aims and only their war aims. Now, due to the lack of modernisation, the Ottoman Empire would have only one way to really achieve this, through surprise and numbers. As the war had already been underway for about a month after the Ottomans joined, an Ottoman win would have to assume the Entente powers had mostly abandoned their Ottoman fronts to focus on Europe. This would have given them the element of surprise. In this scenario, let's say the Ottomans storm the Caucasus and invade the Crimea through their access of the Black Sea. This opens up a whole new front Russia never foresaw, and the rapid loss of land spreads panic through the empire and pressures the Tsar into peace talks. Meanwhile, the Ottomans manage to quickly secure the Suez Canal and begin an unstoppable conquest of North Africa, cutting off the British access to India. The war ends, the Entente surrenders, and the Ottomans hold a major seat at the table. Of course, this is all ridiculous. Let's start in the Balkans. The issue here is that the Ottoman Empire is greatly limited, surrounded by Bulgaria as a result of the Balkan Wars. Even though they won, Bulgaria was an ally, really limiting any chance they could have of reclaiming lost European territories. Luckily for us, it just so happens the Ottomans drew up a list of requirements to the Germans if they were to win the war, which the Germans accepted. They had agreed with Germany already that the Germans would help them settle disagreements over the Balkans with Romania and Bulgaria. The Ottomans wished to regain Western Thrace, with Bulgaria being compensated with extra lands gained in Serbia. Further, the Ottomans had a few other interests, such as the existence of a powerful Romania, even after Romania joined the Entente, reason being they could then use Romania to counterweigh the Bulgarians. A third public interest of the Ottomans was for the maintenance of a Muslim Albania under the rule of a Muslim prince, which would be guaranteed by Austria-Hungary. It was also agreed with the Germans that if Greece was to side with the Entente, then the Ottomans would gain the lost Aegean Islands. But Greece joined in 1917, and for a victorious Ottoman Empire to exist, I think the war would need to be over with fairly quickly, meaning there is no Greek entry into the conflict, and therefore no Ottoman gains on that front. But this is not alternate history. This is looking at likely war aims, so I will add it to the map anyway. On the Russian front, the Ottomans had agreed with the Germans that the Muslim-held regions of Azerbaijan would be granted to the Ottoman Empire. Russia would likely have some further trading restrictions, or maybe have been forced to create a buffer state Ottoman puppet on the border, pushing back the Russian threat. In the east, the British and Russian zones of influence would likely have come to an end, and Persia would have fallen under the Ottoman sphere of influence. They also desired the same for Afghanistan too, but this was seen as a longer-term goal. The final agreement made with Germany was a promise of war indemnity, which I believe would be very important to them. The Ottomans would request a clearing of all debt with their enemies and a massive import of wealth to further fund their industrialisation attempts. The Ottoman Empire would forbid all foreign powers' support and guarantees for internal groups of nationals wishing to seek independence, stabilising the nation. Most territorial gains would be made against Britain, primarily the return of Cyprus, Kuwait and Egypt to the Ottoman Empire, including the valuable Suez Canal, which they would likely enforce a tariff for, allowing both Britain and France to maintain their access to it, but at payment to the Ottoman Empire. And maybe further territorial gains along the Persian Gulf, perhaps. Perhaps if Italy had joined the war, then maybe the return of Libya may have been included in the peace talks, but beyond that, I do not see the Ottomans wishing to expand further. Stability and funding would have been the priority. With this newfound power and wealth, they would likely begin weakening the powers of non-Muslims in the empire and attempt to Turkify the state for the cause of stability. Lastly, their final proposal would possibly be pushed towards the other Central Powers as an agreement to maintain the friendly relations and alliances for the sake of its own stability. We may even have seen something like what Japan pushed through, a recognition of the state as an equal despite their differences. But whether that would be passed or not, I do not know. Something that we would also see if they sided with the Entente. Now on to part 2. If the Ottoman Empire joined the Entente and again just happened to dominate, what would they want here? This should be shorter, as there's less opportunities and it is more reliant on speculation. But using the knowledge learnt on the foreign policy from the last episode, we can at least put something together. Perhaps, first of all, there could be concessions granted to the Ottomans from Britain, Kuwait, maybe even southern Arabia, given there's not much to expand into. But that depends on how much Britain is willing to give away. The British Empire did certainly highly value these lands, and I doubt we would see too much territory swapped for Ottoman support. The only thing I can say with somewhat confidence in the Middle East is that access to the Suez Canal, either free or at a greatly reduced price, would have been granted. It's a small thing, but I imagine the Entente would desperately be scrambling for these minor concessions dotted around to satisfy their partner, rather than surrendering large chunks of territory. A further example would be the Entente granting them influence rights over perhaps Arabia and bits of Persia, a series of small concessions for the sake of appeasement. In the Balkans, I can imagine them gaining Western Thrace back from Bulgaria, and perhaps more. Maybe even Bulgaria, after losing land to all neighbours, could become either an Ottoman vassal or maybe just annex the entire thing. Besides that, the rest of their mind would be set on funding and the cancellation of debt, followed by guarantees of stable alliances. We have to remember that despite their successes in such a scenario, racial and religious beliefs would always be held against them by the other powers. This would limit their negotiating power. As we know from history, they could easily get ganged up on by the rest and forced to accept less. It is not tied to war aims, but in an alternate history scenario, it must be considered. I did not bring this argument up for the Central Powers, however, for a very specific reason. If the Ottomans joined the Entente, they would be one of 7, arguably, great powers. In fact, one of 21 nations in total by the end of the war, making their voice less heard, and their power share split between more competing allies. Whereas with the Central Powers, there were only 2 other great powers, and Bulgaria, making it easier for them to find their voice and argue their share, their worth, in the conference. In conclusion, the Entente would certainly have been a safer option for the Ottomans, but one where the rewards would have been incredibly minor despite their efforts, simply because there's not enough to offer. The Ottomans also needed a win, a good win, a show of strength to guarantee stability. With hindsight, the Entente looks like the safer option. But back then, there's argument to be made that the Central Powers appeared on paper more likely to win. Plus, we also have to consider the Entente backing away from the Ottomans compared to the growing goodwill they gained from Germany. Personally, looking at the evidence, and without the ability of knowing the end outcome, I think the Ottoman Empire made the right call when they joined the Central Powers, from a purely logical perspective. Anyway, hope you enjoyed and learnt something. Leave a like if you did, and subscribe to get notified of future episodes. And please share with anybody that you think may be interested. But for now, until the next one, this has been the history of diplomacy.